Hello. This presentation is my presentation for talking about parents' rights in special education. There's a long history of partnership between parents and their children's schools. It's reflected in the 2004 authorization of IDEA, and that strengthened procedural safeguards for parents. As we review these, it's important to note that a copy of parents' rights must be provided at every meeting. When we're looking specifically at Kansas, which is my home state, there are 10 topics that comprise the procedural safeguards of parent rights. The first one is parent participation. Ultimately, schools must give parents a chance to be part of any special education decision made for their child. Those parents need to be given proper notice of any meeting that determines the amount of special education services needed to provide their child with a free, appropriate public education. Next, the procedural safeguards and parents' rights define what a parent is. Schools have to establish the correct person to make educational decisions for a student. These decisions include receiving notice, providing or denying consent, filling out formal complaints, calling for mediation, filing due process requests, and also giving the permission or denying permission for the release of records. Currently, Kansas defines parents as a biological parent, an adoptive parent, a person acting as a parent, and that could be a grandparent or a step parent who is living in the same household as the child or another family member, a legal guardian, an officially appointed educational advocate, or a foster parent, as long as they are also the educational advocate for that child. If students live in multiple homes where both parents have rights, the school has to give notice to both parents. However, only one parent is needed to consent to services. But if the other parent disagrees, they may request mediation or file due process claims. The third component is parents' rights in special education notice. And this really talks about how parents need to be informed of their rights, and it must be provided at least once a year. They also need to be provided when a student is referred for an evaluation or a parent requests that evaluation, at the first formal complaint or due process request in a school year, when a disciplinary action results in removal from a student that equals a change in placement, and also anytime parents ask for a copy. When we talk about prior written notice, we're talking about the fact that the school has to provide that notice for proposed special education changes. This includes starting or changing a student's identification, evaluation, educational placement, or special education and related services. These written notices must contain clear, specific descriptions of the proposed action. They must be provided in language understandable to non educators. They cannot be jargon heavy documents. They also need to be provided and communicated in the parent's native language. Finally, we talk about parent consent. And parent consent must always be informed consent accompanied by a prior written notice. This includes situations that are initiation or changing a student's identification, evaluation, placement, or providing special education related services. The parents must have full knowledge of the proposed action. They must agree in writing. They must understand that their consent is optional. And they also need to know that if they revoke consent in the future, it's not retroactive. So if a parent consents to services and then decide a year later that they're going to pull their child from public schools and homeschool them and don't want those services anymore, they they revoke services for the rest of that IEP year, that wouldn't be retroactive. Consent is required for initial evals, re-evals, starting special ed services, substantial changes in placement, and that's a greater than 25% change in a student's day, material change in services, which is a 25% increase or decrease in service amounts, adding new services or removing services, or providing an evaluation or services in a private school setting. Parents also need to consent if an IEP team member is not at the meeting. An outside agency is invited in order for the district to bill Medicaid or private insurance. However, for these, they don't need to be provided prior notice. Parent consent isn't required to review existing data as part of an evaluation. It's not required to give student a test that's given to all children. So if there's a screener given to all third graders, a student with an IEP can be given that test, that screener, without parental consent. And then also other proposed actions where the consent requirement is not specified. Consent may be given in person or electronically, and that was critical over the last school year. Finally, or not finally, but next, when parent consent has been requested, but it's not provided. So if the parents don't agree to the proposed actions, so there are two specific situations. I touched on one a little bit ago. First, if parents don't respond, the school needs to make appropriate attempts to get their consent. After two documented attempts by two different methods, parent consent is not required for the proposal. It's also important to note at this point that if the school makes a proposal for things that require consent, so those substantial changes in placement, those material change in services, initiation or removal of services, placement in special education, if a parent does not consent to those things happening, they won't happen. Parents are the drivers in the process. And then the other point is that parent consent is voluntary and it can be revoked at any time. This has to be done in writing, and as I said before, it's not retroactive. The next component is the notice of an IEP meeting. And an IEP meeting has to be held at a time that is agreeable to both the parents and the school. Written notice has to be provided. And then that notice needs to include why the team is meeting. It needs to include the time, the date, and the location. It also needs to include the titles of the school team members attending. So when I was a special education teacher, it wouldn't say Joel Addis is attending. It would say special education teacher. It also needs to include notification that the parents can invite people they feel have knowledge of their child. After a student turns 14, the notice has to include if the meeting will cover consideration of post-secondary goals and services, and then also transitions. If the school will identify and invite the student, and then name any other agencies that would be invited. So if there's an agency that's going to help with the transition for a student, that agency needs to be identified. The next part that really deals with parent rights, and it's really the last one, is the rights for parents of gifted students. And in Kansas, gifted children are considered students with exceptionalities. It's interesting though, because gifted services are not compulsory, so parents have the choice to accept the services offered by the school team. Once the parent gives that consent, though, the school has to offer those IEP services to the student. Really, the last two components deal with situations where the parents don't necessarily have direct rights for the student. And the first one is with educational advocates. And an educational advocate is assigned to act on a student's behalf when the parents aren't known, they're not available, or where their rights have been severed. The Kansas State Board of Ed has the authority to assign advocates in these situations. The LEA, the local education agency, has an obligation to identify and find a child's parents before that any special education action is taken. And then they have ways to decide if an advocate is needed. If a parent doesn't respond to the school team, but they're able to be located, an educational advocate isn't needed. And that situation was covered a little earlier, where if the school has made two attempts to contact a parent with two different documented ways, then that parental consent isn't necessarily required. And then there's a similar burden on the Department for Children and Families and the Department of Corrections in terms of determining if an educational advocate is needed. So if a child was under DCF's purview or DOC's, they have a similar responsibility to the school to find or determine if there's an advocate needed and then find one. The last component is what happens when a student turns 18. At the age of 18, students in Kansas are legal adults, and the rights of a parent transfer to that student. At that point, the students are their own educational decision makers. A student's IEP must contain notification of this on or before a student's 17th birthday. So it's not just a surprise sprung on families when a student turns 18. They have some time to prepare for that eventuality which is important, especially when you think about some of the more significant exceptionalities where parents might need to retain some decision making rights past an individual's 18th birthday. So, when we look at the why for these safeguards, they create a more equal experience for all parents, and they also facilitate parents' voice in the special education partnership and processes. As I think back on my time as a special education teacher, I think the best working relationships I had with parents were the ones where those parents had a voice. And, not that every time we were clearly defining, and checking back on parents' rights to make sure that we are directly following it, but the established processes in our district and in our building matched those. And that helped create those strong working relationships that benefited, the parents, it benefited the school team, and ultimately it benefited the students. Here are my references. And with that, I say thank you.